September 5, 1943. 300 feet beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, Commander Eugene Fluckey sat in the wardroom of the USS Barb, reviewing intelligence reports on Japanese convoy movements. The submarine had been at sea for 42 days, operating in waters so hostile that surfacing for more than 30 minutes meant almost certain discovery. His crew of 80 men had survived depth charge attacks, endured tropical heat that turned their steel vessel into an oven, and subsisted on whatever provisions could be crammed into every available space before departure. They believed they understood the nature of this war, the sacrifices required, the limits of what could be expected in combat. They were about to discover how profoundly wrong they were. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these submariners and their adversaries in the Imperial Japanese Navy could not have imagined was that the industrial capacity of their home nation would manifest itself not just in the tonnage of ships produced or the number of aircraft manufactured, but in something as seemingly frivolous as frozen desserts served hundreds of feet below the ocean's surface. This revelation would fundamentally alter Japanese naval intelligence assessments and provide one of the most unexpected psychological advantages of the entire Pacific campaign. The story begins not in the Pacific theater, but in the industrial heartland of the United States, where in 1941, production facilities were being converted from civilian to military manufacturing at a pace unprecedented in human history. The Manitowoc Shipbuilding Company in Wisconsin, previously known for constructing lake freighters and passenger vessels, received contracts to build 28 submarines for the Pacific Fleet. These vessels would be constructed on the shores of Lake Michigan, then somehow transported through the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi River to reach the ocean, a logistical achievement that seemed impossible to European observers. But it was not merely the construction that set American submarine production apart. Lieutenant Commander Howard Gilmore, reviewing specifications for the new Gato-class submarines being commissioned in early 1942, noted with bemusement that the design included refrigeration systems far exceeding what would be necessary for food preservation alone. The specifications called for cold storage capacity sufficient to maintain dozens of different compartments at varying temperatures, with redundant cooling systems that seemed excessive for a vessel designed primarily for combat operations. The reasoning became apparent only when supply officers began loading the submarines for their first combat patrols. Chief Commissary Steward James Thompson, assigned to the USS Silversides, supervised the loading of provisions that included not just standard military rations, but fresh vegetables, dairy products, high-quality cuts of meat, and in the case of several submarines, the components necessary to manufacture ice cream, sherbet, and other frozen desserts while at sea. Thompson later wrote in his diary, which was discovered in Naval Archives in 1987, that he initially questioned whether the weight allocated to these luxury items might be better used for additional torpedoes or fuel. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Creed Burlingame, explained the strategic thinking behind this decision in terms that would prove prophetic. The average submarine patrol in the Pacific lasted between 50 and 60 days. Unlike surface vessels, submarines could not receive regular supply ships or put into friendly ports for reprovisioning. The crew lived in a steel tube approximately 300 feet long and 27 feet wide, sharing space with torpedoes, diesel fuel, battery acid, and all the machinery necessary to sustain life underwater. Morale, Burlingame explained, was not a luxury. It was ammunition. The Imperial Japanese Navy, meanwhile, approached submarine warfare from an entirely different philosophical foundation. Captain Takeo Mori, who commanded the submarine I-74 during operations off the Solomon Islands, kept detailed logs that were later captured and translated by American intelligence officers. His entries reveal a service culture that emphasized spiritual discipline and acceptance of hardship as fundamental to warrior identity. Japanese submarines carried minimal provisions, with crews expected to endure deprivation as part of their duty. The concept of using limited cargo space for anything beyond essential military supplies would have been considered not just wasteful, but spiritually corrupting. This philosophical divide manifested in practical terms that became increasingly significant as the war progressed. American submarines operating in the Pacific in 1943 carried on average 12,000 pounds of fresh and frozen food, compared to approximately 7,000 pounds carried by comparable Japanese submarines. But the difference was not merely quantitative. The American provisioning strategy reflected an understanding of human psychology that would prove to be a force multiplier as important as any technological advantage. Commander Fluckey's USS Barb departed Pearl Harbor on September 1, 1943, loaded with 24 Mark 14 torpedoes, 55,000 gallons of diesel fuel, and a remarkable array of provisions that included 300 pounds of coffee, 200 pounds of fresh potatoes, 150 pounds of onions, and the ingredients necessary to produce fresh ice cream throughout the patrol. The submarine also carried a specially modified freezer unit that could produce 12 gallons of ice cream in approximately 4 hours, using powdered milk, sugar, eggs, vanilla extract, and whatever flavoring ingredients the crew's imagination could devise. The ice cream maker was not standard equipment. It had been fabricated by the submarine's engineering crew during their refit period, using spare parts from refrigeration units and metal shop equipment. Chief Machinist's mate Robert Palmer had led the project, working from rough sketches and trial-and-error experimentation to create a device that could function reliably despite the motion of the submarine and the limitations of available electrical power. The final product weighed 43 pounds and required modification of the submarine's electrical distribution system to provide adequate power without compromising combat systems. Palmer's innovation spread rapidly through the submarine force. By the end of 1943, approximately 60% of American submarines operating in the Pacific had some form of ice cream making capability, either through officially sanctioned equipment or crew-fabricated devices. The submarine tender USS Fulton, which serviced submarines between patrols at advanced bases, installed industrial ice cream making equipment capable of producing 500 gallons per day, ensuring that submarines arriving for resupply could replenish their frozen dessert supplies along with torpedoes and fuel. The strategic impact of this seemingly trivial luxury became apparent through an unexpected channel. In November 1943, the American submarine USS Sculpin was lost during an engagement with Japanese anti-submarine forces. 42 members of the crew were taken prisoner and transported to Japan for interrogation. Among them was pharmacist's mate first class George Rochek, who had served as the submarine's unofficial ice cream specialist, having developed recipes that used tropical fruits acquired during port calls to create flavors unavailable through standard supply channels. During interrogation at the Ofuna Prisoner Interrogation Center, Japanese naval intelligence officers questioned the captured submariners extensively about American submarine capabilities, tactics, and equipment. The interrogators, trained to extract information about weapons systems, detection equipment, and operational procedures, were unprepared for the responses they received when asking about living conditions aboard American submarines. The prisoners, following their training to provide only name, rank, and serial number for military information, nonetheless spoke freely about non-classified aspects of submarine life. Lieutenant Commander Hajime Nakamura, who conducted many of these interrogations, later testified during war crimes trials that he initially dismissed prisoner statements about ice cream, fresh-baked bread, and elaborate meals as either deliberate misinformation or the exaggerations of men trying to boost their own morale. The claims seemed so implausible given Japanese submarine conditions that Nakamura included them in his report as examples of American propaganda that had apparently convinced even the submariners themselves. However, as more American submarines were lost and more prisoners interrogated, a disturbing pattern emerged. The stories remained consistent across different submarines, different crews, and different interrogation sessions. Prisoners described in detail the ice cream making process, the recipes used, the frequency of production, and even the social rituals surrounding ice cream consumption aboard submarines. Some prisoners, attempting to irritate their captors, elaborated on the varieties available, the practice of trading ice cream for other favors aboard ship, and the competitions held between submarines to create the most unusual flavors. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, who would later command the submarine that engaged the USS Indianapolis, reviewed these interrogation reports in early 1944 as part of his preparation for command. His reaction, recorded in his post-war memoir, reflected a growing realization among Japanese naval officers that they faced an adversary whose industrial capacity exceeded anything their pre-war intelligence had suggested. If the Americans could afford to dedicate cargo space, electrical power, and crew time to producing ice cream aboard combat submarines, what did that suggest about their overall resource availability? The psychological impact extended beyond strategic assessment. Japanese submarine crews, learning through the naval rumor network about American submarine conditions, experienced a progressive erosion of the narrative that had sustained them through hardship. The official position that Japanese spiritual strength would overcome American material advantages became harder to maintain when the material advantages included fresh ice cream served 300 feet underwater while conducting combat operations. Lieutenant Toshio Tanaka, who served aboard the submarine I-58, later described in interviews conducted in 1968 the moment when he fully understood the disparity in industrial capacity between the two nations. His submarine had successfully disrupted an American convoy operation, expending all torpedoes and suffering significant damage that required immediate return to base for repairs. Upon arriving at Truk Lagoon in February 1944, the crew learned that American forces had conducted a massive carrier raid on the base, destroying numerous ships and facilities. Among the captured documents recovered from a damaged American aircraft was a routine supply requisition from a submarine tender that listed, among hundreds of other items, 5,000 gallons of ice cream mix, chocolate syrup, and maraschino cherries. Tanaka recalled that this single document affected crew morale more significantly than intelligence briefings about American ship production numbers. Abstract statistics about factory output could be dismissed or rationalized, but ice cream was tangible, immediate, and undeniable. It represented a level of resource abundance that made Japanese deprivation seem not noble, but simply inadequate. The ice cream phenomenon took on additional dimensions as the war progressed. American submarine crews, aware that their living conditions exceeded those of their adversaries, began to use ice cream as a form of psychological warfare. When the USS Tang surfaced to rescue Japanese sailors from ships it had engaged, crew members offered the survivors ice cream along with medical attention and dry clothing. The gesture, intended as humanitarian, had the unintended effect of creating profound cognitive dissonance among the survivors, who had been taught that Americans were barbaric and spiritually inferior. Captain Shoichi Nakao, one of the few Japanese merchant marine officers to survive multiple engagements with American submarines and live to write about his experiences, described being rescued by the USS Seahorse in April 1944. After being pulled from the water, treated for exposure and injuries, and given clean clothes, he was offered vanilla ice cream in the submarine's crew mess. The experience, he later wrote, destroyed his ability to maintain the ideological framework that had sustained him through years of war. He could rationalize being defeated by superior weapons or numbers, but the casual abundance represented by serving ice cream to enemy prisoners exceeded his capacity to incorporate into his understanding of the conflict. The industrial story behind the ice cream was as remarkable as its psychological impact. The United States in 1943 produced approximately 1.5 billion pounds of ice cream annually for military consumption alone, separate from civilian production. This required a supply chain that included dairy farms across 48 states, sugar production facilities in Hawaii and Puerto Rico, vanilla plantations in Madagascar that continued operating despite Japanese occupation of surrounding territories, and a refrigerated shipping network that transported frozen products across the Pacific despite submarine threats. The USS Bowfin, conducting operations off the coast of Japan in November 1943, carried among its provisions 50 pounds of vanilla extract, 60 pounds of cocoa powder, 40 pounds of butterscotch chips, and 200 pounds of sugar specifically allocated for dessert production. These ingredients had been grown, harvested, processed, packaged, and shipped across thousands of miles of ocean to reach a submarine that would spend the next 60 days attempting to disrupt enemy shipping. The logistics involved in maintaining this supply chain, while simultaneously producing the ships, aircraft, weapons, and fuel necessary to conduct offensive operations, demonstrated industrial capacity at a scale that Japan could not match. Commander Toyoho Horikoshi, serving in Japanese naval intelligence in Tokyo, compiled reports throughout 1944 attempting to assess American industrial capacity based on captured documents, prisoner interrogations, and signals intelligence. His classified assessment, discovered in archives after the war, concluded that American submarines represented not merely a tactical threat, but a strategic indicator of resource abundance that Japan could not hope to match. He specifically cited ice cream production as evidence that American industry operated with surplus capacity even while conducting global warfare, suggesting that any strategy based on exhausting American resources through attrition was fundamentally flawed. The ice cream story intersected with broader patterns of American submarine provisioning that reflected similar abundance. Submarines carried fresh bread that was baked daily in onboard ovens, fresh coffee that was available at all hours, meat that was served in cuts and quality exceeding what many crew members had access to in civilian life, and sufficient variety that menus could run through a 30-day cycle without repeating meals. This contrasted sharply with Japanese submarine provisions, which consisted primarily of rice, dried fish, pickled vegetables, and occasionally fresh food that spoiled within days of departure. Chief Steward Harold Johnson, who served aboard multiple submarines during the war, maintained detailed menus and recipes that were later donated to the Naval History and Heritage Command. His records show that a typical submarine patrol included meals such as roast turkey with stuffing, fried chicken with mashed potatoes, pot roast with vegetables, spaghetti with meat sauce, and fresh-baked pies. Ice cream was served an average of 3 times per week, with flavors ranging from standard vanilla and chocolate to experimental combinations created by crew members, including one memorable attempt to create pineapple coconut ice cream using fresh fruit acquired during a port call in Australia. The social rituals surrounding ice cream aboard submarines developed into elaborate traditions. On some submarines, ice cream was served on Sundays after the evening meal, creating a weekly celebration that broke the monotony of extended patrols. Other submarines held ice cream competitions, with crew members voting on favorite recipes and winners receiving extra rations or preferred watch schedules. The USS Wahoo under Commander Dudley Morton developed a tradition of serving ice cream after successful engagements with enemy vessels, creating a positive association between combat achievement and immediate reward. These traditions had measurable effects on crew cohesion and performance. Submarine duty in the Pacific was extraordinarily dangerous, with approximately 22% of submarine crew members lost during the war, the highest casualty rate of any American military branch. The psychological stress of spending months underwater, knowing that mechanical failure, detection by enemy forces, or simple bad luck could result in sudden death, required coping mechanisms that maintained morale and mental health. Ice cream, seemingly frivolous, provided a tangible connection to normalcy and comfort that helped crews maintain psychological equilibrium. Medical officers serving with submarine squadrons noted that submarines with better food quality and variety showed lower rates of stress-related illness, interpersonal conflict, and performance degradation during extended patrols. Captain Charles Lockwood, commander of submarine forces in the Pacific, considered food quality sufficiently important that he ordered the submarine tender USS Proteus to install expanded galley facilities and hire additional cooks to ensure submarines received maximum provisioning support. He explicitly rejected suggestions that cargo space devoted to food variety could be better used for additional weapons or fuel, arguing that crew effectiveness depended on maintaining morale through every means available. The Japanese naval leadership's gradual recognition of the implications behind American submarine provisioning capabilities influenced strategic planning in unexpected ways. Vice Admiral Teruhisa Komatsu, analyzing American submarine operations in mid-1944, concluded that defeating the submarine threat required not just improved anti-submarine tactics or weapons, but a fundamental reorganization of Japanese industrial production to match American output. His recommendations, which included proposals to increase submarine provisioning, improve crew living conditions, and extend patrol durations through better supply management, were rejected as incompatible with available resources and existing production priorities. This rejection reflected a broader strategic paralysis within Japanese naval planning. By 1944, Japanese leadership recognized that American industrial capacity exceeded their pre-war estimates by factors of 3 to 5 across virtually every category of military production. But this recognition came too late to alter strategic commitments made in 1941 and 1942, when Japanese planning assumed that American industrial potential would not be fully mobilized or effectively employed in time to affect the war's outcome. The ice cream aboard American submarines symbolized the fatal miscalculation underlying Japanese strategy. The assumption that American society, comfortable and pleasure-seeking, would lack the discipline necessary for sustained warfare. The reality proved opposite. American industrial organization channeled the same efficiency that mass-produced consumer goods into military production without requiring the population to abandon expectations of comfort and abundance. Workers in American factories produced record quantities of war materials while maintaining living standards that included rationed but available consumer goods. The military fought with unprecedented effectiveness while maintaining supply chains that included ice cream makers for submarines. This combination of material abundance and combat effectiveness exceeded what Japanese planners had believed possible. The psychological dimension extended to the highest levels of Japanese leadership. When Emperor Hirohito met with naval leaders in February 1945 to discuss the deteriorating strategic situation, the discussion included reference to American submarine capabilities. According to notes taken by Imperial Household Minister Tsuneo Matsudaira, which were discovered during research in 1992, the emperor specifically asked whether reports about American submarine provisions were accurate. When confirmed, he reportedly expressed concern that Japan faced an adversary whose resource base permitted luxury even during combat operations, suggesting a depth of industrial capacity that could not be overcome through spiritual strength alone. The final operations of the Pacific War saw American submarines conducting missions that would have been impossible without the provisioning systems that had developed over 4 years of combat. The USS Tigrone conducted a 73-day patrol in the Sea of Japan from July through September 1945, remaining submerged for days at a time in shallow, heavily patrolled waters. The crew maintained combat effectiveness throughout this extended operation, in part because their living conditions, while certainly difficult, included food quality and variety that prevented the nutritional and morale degradation that would have affected less well-supplied crews. The submarine carried enough provisions, including ice cream ingredients, to serve approximately 5,000 meals during the patrol without repeating menus. After Japan's surrender, in August 1945, American submarines conducted humanitarian missions that included transporting medical supplies and food to prisoner-of-war camps. The USS Spikefish, arriving at Yokohama Harbor in September 1945, served ice cream to liberated prisoners from multiple nations who had endured years of deprivation. For many of these former prisoners, the ice cream represented their first tangible evidence that the war had truly ended, that they had survived to return to a world where such simple pleasures remained possible. Former Japanese naval officers, interviewed during occupation and in subsequent decades, consistently cited American submarine capabilities as evidence of the industrial disparity that made defeat inevitable. But their focus was not primarily on torpedoes or detection equipment or diving capabilities. Instead, they returned repeatedly to ice cream, fresh bread, and abundant food as symbols of resource availability that exceeded anything Japanese industry could match. Captain Orita Zenji, who commanded multiple submarines during the war, stated in a 1958 interview that he knew Japan would lose the war when he learned that American submarines had ice cream makers. The statement was not facetious. It reflected a recognition that industrial capacity sufficient to provide luxuries during combat operations implied strategic depth that could not be defeated. The ice cream phenomenon influenced post-war naval development in unexpected ways. The United States Navy continued to prioritize crew comfort in submarine design, leading to progressively more sophisticated food service and provisioning systems. Modern nuclear submarines carry ice cream machines as standard equipment, along with extensive food service facilities that would seem luxurious by civilian standards. This design philosophy, which treats crew comfort as a combat multiplier rather than a luxury, traces its origins directly to World War II experiences in the Pacific. The broader lesson transcended specific equipment or provisions. What the ice cream makers represented was an approach to warfare that recognized human factors as equally important to material factors. Japanese naval culture, with its emphasis on spiritual discipline and acceptance of hardship, produced crews of undeniable courage and dedication. But courage alone could not overcome strategic disparity when opponents possessed both material abundance and the organizational sophistication to maintain that abundance even during combat operations thousands of miles from home bases. The story of ice cream aboard American submarines illuminates the nature of industrial warfare in ways that discussions of production statistics and logistics networks sometimes obscure. A nation capable of providing ice cream to submarine crews 300 feet underwater while conducting combat operations possessed not just factories and resources, but systematic organizational capacity at every level of society. This capacity, developed over decades of industrial development and refined through the demands of global warfare, represented a form of national power that exceeded anything achievable through military force alone. For the submariners who served aboard American submarines, ice cream remained a cherished memory long after the war ended. Veterans' reunions featured ice cream socials, where survivors shared recipes and competed to recreate flavors from their wartime service. These gatherings, continuing into the 21st century, maintained traditions that began in the desperate campaigns of 1943 and 1944, when ice cream provided a moment of normalcy in the midst of circumstances that were anything but normal. The Japanese admirals who never expected American submarines to have ice cream makers were not unique in their miscalculation. Military history is filled with examples of commanders who underestimated adversaries based on preconceptions that proved fatally wrong. But the ice cream story stands apart because it reveals the miscalculation with such unexpected clarity. In focusing on spiritual strength versus material abundance, Japanese strategic planning failed to recognize that modern industrial societies could provide both material comfort and combat effectiveness, that abundance and discipline were not opposites, but potentially complementary. The submarines returned to port, their war patrols completed, their crews deserving rest and recognition. The ice cream makers, some official equipment and some improvised from spare parts, continued serving desserts that seemed impossibly frivolous given the circumstances of their production. But they were not frivolous. They were evidence of strategic depth, organizational sophistication, and industrial capacity that ultimately determined the war's outcome as surely as any battle or campaign. The admirals who dismissed the reports as propaganda or exaggeration had failed to understand that in total warfare between industrial societies, the capacity to provide ice cream to submarine crews was not a luxury. It was a statement of power. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.